Oh God, it does it automatically. Okay.
No problem.
No, but I'll get the web designer to cut off the extraneous bits, and we'll just wait until.
Get all my coughing out. Start.
We might alternate between that. I have a very dry cough, so we'll see. We'll see. Okay, we'll start the webinar. We've clocked over to the hour, and I know that it is early for some people, late for others, but it's a nice in between for our guest today. But let me begin. So, welcome to this third webinar in our series of early career researchers in cultural heritage law development series, organised under the auspices of the UNESCO Chair in International Law at the University of Technology, Sydney. The ECR development series is designed to hone the skills of early career researchers in a field which has previously been viewed as niche, but as our discussion today will show, it is finding increasing avenues for publication of important research and its dissemination among academics, practitioners and the general public. Our webinar topics are defined by those undertaking higher degree research in the field. Earlier seminars have looked at research methodology and journal submission processes. Today's webinar will focus on the book submission process, something that you, I hope, will consider upon successful completion of your dissertation. Before I introduce my fellow panelists, I would like to make 2 points. We will be focusing on one particular series because of our respective roles. The first dedicated series in the field of cultural heritage law, published by a leading academic press, Oxford University Press, Cultural Heritage Law and Policy series, established over a decade ago now. There are several dedicated book series in the field now, and the points made during our discussion will no doubt help in the preparation of book proposals and the submission process generally. It is also hoped that this deep dive into one particular book series will free up more time for Q&A. And although this webinar is designed for early career researchers, the series itself is not exclusively dedicated to ECRs, that is the book series. Therefore, we hope that our discussion will be beneficial to all scholars who are considering this book series as a possible place to publish their research. Now is time to introduce myself and my fellow panelists for this webinar. My name is Anna Filipa Vrdoljak. I'm the UNESCO Chair holder and the General Editor of the Cultural Heritage Law and Policy book series. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Robert Kavouris, the International Law Editor at OUP, with responsibility for this series at the press. I am extremely grateful to Robert for taking time to be part of this webinar. I must also acknowledge the long-standing support of Robert and his colleagues at OUP in publishing important research in the field of cultural heritage law and policy. Now, before we commence our discussion, a bit of housekeeping. Our discussion, that is, the panelists will be talking for about 30 minutes. I will provide a short introduction and reflection on the series, and Robert will provide us with the nuts and bolts of our discussion, that is the how-to in relation to book submissions. This will enable a period of Q&A at the end of the panel discussion. Attendees are asked to pop their questions that they may have for us in the chat function. This will then be discussed at the end of the last presentation. A recording of this webinar and information about the program will be available at the UNESCO Chair website, links to which will be provided to participants after the event. Before I let Robert speak, if you could indulge me a little bit more, I'd like to provide a short introduction to the OUP Cultural Heritage Law and Policy book series. I'm sure that Robert will provide us with more accurate statistics, but I can say that it commenced over a decade ago with a title, sometimes two, being published every year since. Many of the titles have been authored by persons who have since gone on to be leading scholars in the field, often making the first important scholarly contribution to the topic covered by their monograph. There is also a couple of prize winners in that mix. And I'm also very proud that there's a good gender balance there amongst the authors. I must confess that the choice of this webinar this year was also an opportunity to acknowledge the debt that I and indeed our authors owe to my co-general editor of the series, Professor Francesco Francioni, who passed away early last year. He was ever receptive to ideas which would promote our legal knowledge in this field and foster and disseminate important scholarship, which would better our understanding of its law and practice. He was always collegial and especially nurturing of young scholars. And the series and monographs and edited collections published under it are a testament to that. Francesco and I had intended the series to attract a readership of scholars, policymakers, practitioners, and the general public from around the world, as befits the topic and the concerns that the series covers. The research and scholarship it seeks to highlight, we hope, is making a real impact in the world. This webinar is very much seeking to promote this foundational drive of the series. So it is now my great pleasure to hand over to Robert for his presentation.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you all for being here and for the opportunity to talk a bit and to hopefully provide some useful information for anyone really who's thinking about turning their research into a book, submitting a book proposal. And of course, obviously, we're focused on the Cultural Heritage Law and Policy series, and that's probably the area where most of you work or where you do your research. But I think hopefully, like Anna alluded to, what I have to say might be helpful, even if you're thinking about your dissertation now, or you're thinking about your second book in a few years, and if you are, if you do research in other areas as well. I think all of these things are really broadly applicable. But of course, this series is very important, and one we're really proud to publish because I think the best case scenario for us as a publisher when we undertake a new series is that it's going to really lay the groundwork for research in a way that didn't exist before. And I think this is really a case study in a successful application of a series for that purpose, for really opening up space in the field, creating a kind of pole of attraction for cutting edge research, and for I think more than a decade on now, being able to kind of see the fruits of that, both with this series and with our other our series of commentaries on international cultural heritage law as well, edited by Anna and by Francesco. So I think they're landmarks in the field, and we're proud to be associated with them. So with that in mind, I'll just go into talking a bit about what are the steps to take if you are thinking about turning your dissertation or other research project into a book, finding the publisher, finding the right place for it, going through the actual process. And I'll talk a bit about what this entails, the process from kind of submitting a proposal to the kind of peer reviews to the kind of approvals and confirmations that you get from, as part of that process and from a publisher, and then the contract that you would receive at the end of that process if you're successful. So I'll talk about the general process, and then I'll talk a little bit about parts of the proposal itself, questions I often get about the proposal. And then I'll hand it back to Anna to fill in anything she'd like to say specifically about the series and about kinds of things she's thinking about as the series editor. And then we can open up for questions, I think, and I'm sure anything I don't get to, please do feel free to ask. I know at this stage, if you're an early career researcher and you've never been through this process, it can seem very opaque, but it doesn't have to be. And also just flag now, though I'll try to remember to mention it again on the way out. There is a page that I think was shared with the invitation to this webinar from OUP that has a number of different resources for early career researchers and some FAQs and some videos and interviews with people who've been through the process. So that might also be useful. Um, but for my part, I'll say, the first thing that you'll be thinking about as you approach either defending your dissertation or having finished it and kind of returning to it maybe after some time, as people often do, is just picking a publisher and finding the right home for your research. So I hope that the right home, if you work in cultural heritage law and policy, is our series in cultural heritage law and policy. Um, but if you have other research or if you just want to consider your options, I think it makes total sense to browse the websites of publishers, look through series, think about, whether there's a series where you've read a lot that's been beneficial for you and whether your research would therefore fit with the themes and approach of that series. And they're all different, right? Every publisher maybe has a little bit of a different place within the field, within any field. I'm thinking of international law generally, different emphases that we have versus what Cambridge has versus what some of the smaller university presses have. So I think it's good to consider that, because I think fundamentally as an editor, I'm thinking, what are the projects that fit with our strengths, fit with the approach we want to take, and also kind of move it forward. You know, it's a kind of looking for things in a sweet spot of being consistent with how we view ourselves as a publisher, but also presenting something novel, presenting a new contribution that doesn't just kind of repeat what we already have on the list. Um, so, if you go to any publisher website, if you go to OUP's website, you'll find my name, my contact info, which I can also pass on at the end of this in the chat. Um, but you'll also see a kind of blurb with a series of topics of interest for me as an editor. Um, and so, aside from just looking at the offerings of a particular publisher, you can search around their website and usually find who is the actual editor for your area and what are they looking for. Um, and hopefully that's sort of up to date and gives you some idea of the kinds of work, the methodologies, the kinds of, if they're looking for interdisciplinary work or if they're looking for really doctrinal legal work. And you can see where your research fits. And again, it gives you a kind of a way to make sure you're connecting with the right editor. And you can also, I think, to start, even sometimes choose a few people, choose a few publishers if you're not exactly sure, and also because you don't know what's going to happen with any one of them. I think it's okay to send out a few inquiries. Um, I get this question a lot. Can I send a proposal and some sample materials to a bunch of publishers at once? I think it's okay to do that, but I think if you want to reach out to a bunch of different publishers at once first to gauge their interest, just send a short email saying, here's the abstract, or here's what my work is about. Here's what I'm thinking. Is this of interest? And ideally, you'll get an answer at that stage. I think, for my part, I usually do like to then see the proposal because you can only learn so much from a short blurb. But at least that way, you can figure out maybe where your best kind of point of entry is for this process, who's the most interested in your topic, that kind of thing. I think once you send a proposal out, a formal proposal, the parts of which I'll talk about shortly, um, then it makes sense to be a little more careful in the sense that I think ideally, from my standpoint, I don't want to send something to peer review if it's already under peer review with another publisher. We might be contacting the same reviewers. It gets confusing. There's a lot of work on the part of an editor that goes into trying to secure those reviews. So I think at that stage, you should, make sure you're upfront about whether this is an exclusive submission or whether, the process has reached a similar stage with any other publisher. But I think at the outset, it's okay to cast a slightly wider net and just inquire. And then to just, maintain a line of communication once you do have an editor's attention and just let them know where your project stands, whether you are talking to other publishers, that kind of thing. I think open communication is probably the best way to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page and we know uh, that we're proceeding in a way that makes sense for us as a publisher, but also for you as an author. We're not wasting anyone's time. Um, Now, there's also, you could reach out directly to someone like me, an acquisitions editor at a press, but with a series like this, you can also reach out to the series editor, and that information is also available on any publisher's website. So, if it's a matter of sending something directly to Anna instead of sending it to me, that could also make sense, especially if you have a prior connection and you have, crossed paths in some way before. And in that case, then we'll talk. Anna and I will talk, and she'll refer those proposals to me that she thinks are of interest for the series, and then the process will kind of continue in the same way from that point. But you do have the sort of option, and I think if I had received a proposal for the series, then my first move would be to share it with Anna. So either way, I think the point is we're both going to see it at the outset and then decide whether we want to send it to peer review. Now, you might be familiar with the peer review process in that it's very similar with books as it is to with journals. Um, I think there, I was going to say it might be faster with journals, although I don't know that that's actually people's experience with journals. You would think that because you're talking about a shorter piece of research, the peer review process might be faster with journals, but I think often, there's some issues in terms of how many resources they have to devote to those processes, so those might also be slow. Um, but I think the thing to keep in mind with a book proposal um, is that if we have a proposal and some sample chapters, or a proposal and a copy of your thesis, and we're sending that out to peer review, we're kind of asking a lot of the reviewers, right? We're asking them for hopefully very close engagement with a lot of material. So it does take us time to find people who have the availability to do that. It can take few weeks. You can also have cases where someone agrees to do a peer review and then subsequently says, "Oh, I didn't really have time to get to it. Can I have more time?" So the timing will vary. And I think it's just good to bear in mind that often the variance in the time it takes to get a peer review process from start to finish has nothing to do with your proposal or with its desirability to the publisher. I think it's easy to think like, "Oh, I haven't heard anything. That must mean they've forgotten about it." Um, I don't forget about proposals. If they take a long time, usually there's something happening in the background that's just causing a delay, but it's not a reflection on how important the proposal is. Um, and in that case, I think it's totally legitimate from an author's perspective to just reach out and say, "Hey, you said this would take 4 to 6 weeks, which would maybe be my starting point often, what I would tell authors. But now it's been 6 weeks and I still haven't heard. Um, and then, I can tell you what's going on. Say, okay, we had to find another reviewer, or we've given an extension to a reviewer, or I have one review, I'm waiting for the other. So it's okay to stay in touch, I think, throughout that process. Um, and I would just ask your patience. I know it can be frustrating because these projects are very important to you as they are to us, but it's a lot of your energy and years of work that's gone into it. So I can understand that you expect timely answers. I think it's okay to ask for them, and just with some recognition that it does take a little bit of time, more time than I would like, is what I'm trying to convey, but it does take time. Um, if we've sent a proposal to peer review and we get back feedback from a couple of reviewers, and at OUP, we're usually looking for 2 to 3 reviews initially, with the hope that, you know, 2 very supportive reviews would give me enough of a basis to continue the process and to move it forward. Um, but of course, every case is different. And so sometimes you have reviews that are very positive, but they also have a lot of suggestions for revision, or they have some more critical notes along with an overall supportive response. In those cases, I would send back to an author the responses, with usually a little bit of my own feedback about what I make of the responses, and then give the opportunity for the author to either have a conversation with me, have a call and discuss the proposal and discuss the review process a bit more at that point, or just to even over email exchange some questions and answers, with the idea that then it's back in the author's court to pursue those revisions, or to, if, as with any kind of journal or any other peer review process, as the author, you're always in a position to say, "I see the reviewer's point, but I actually disagree. Here's my thinking. Here's my rationale for why I want to approach it my way instead of their way." Um, it's always a bit of a kind of give and take like that, I think. But the main point is you have an opportunity to respond, and hopefully the reviews are helping you develop the project. Even if they're positive, the goal would be that they offer you something by which to develop it even more. Or if they're negative, and it can of course happen that um, you get reviewers who are just not really on board. Um, even then, and that could lead to a situation where the process is kind of over, and we say like, look, I was interested in this project. I think there's some value in it, of course, but I can't really move ahead with these kind of reviews. There's obviously a lot of work to be done. Um, and and in those cases too, I mean, my hope is always that the reviews help an author, even if they ultimately don't publish the work with OUP and they, go through a longer process of revision on their own and maybe rethink the project a bit, as is sometimes necessary. Um, I think still even very critical reviews can ultimately be helpful. So that's always my hope. But in the best case scenario, you have some positive reviews, you have a few revisions, a few things to respond to, and which point um, I would then take a proposal, sometimes somewhat informally. I would go back to the reviewers if they were a little bit mixed and say, does this satisfy your concerns? Um, Sometimes if if the revisions are more extensive and you've done a significant rethinking of your proposal as a result of the review process, and let's say they were mixed but still positive enough to move forward, then I might reach back out to the reviewers and ask them for a more formal second look at a proposal, or I might even bring in another reviewer at that point, which is, I think, usually to the author's benefit to get a fresh pair of eyes. Um, After it's been through one round of review and it's changed a bit. But these things all depend on a case by case basis. The main thing I'm looking for is two or three, in the end, very positive reviews. Because what happens next, I would consult with a series editor at that stage. We would talk about the process. But if we're both on the same page that we want to move ahead, then I'm bringing it to a couple of committees internally. One of them is what we call the Law Publishing Committee. Every discipline has their own publishing committee at the press. And that's mostly other editors. It's like an editorial board, kind of. It's other editors, some people from our marketing team, some people from our sales team. And we look at the project partially, intellectually in terms of what is this adding to our list that's not already on it. But also, as a question of, is this financially viable? How would we market this book? Where would it kind of sit among our other offerings? Um, for the most part, if a project with me reaches that point, I think it hopefully would go smoothly through there because I've already, I have a lot of experience with the board or with the publishing committee, and I kind of know the kinds of things that are likely to come up there. But unexpected things happen. And sometimes it's really for me to sort out, what does the sales model for this particular book look like, that kind of thing. Um, but if all goes well there, then it goes to the Oxford delegates. And so this is the kind of final round of approval that we need to offer a contract for a new book. Um, and this is a bit, it I don't want to say it's necessarily more involved, but the delegates are usually faculty of Oxford University. Sometimes they're appointed by faculty of Oxford University to kind of represent the university for this purpose. And so sometimes they have serious, substantive questions about a project. And, sometimes they can even say, okay, this is all good, but actually there's this one problem and I want to send it back out to another reviewer. So there can be other things at that stage. And again, I think, just to sort of reiterate a point I made before, this isn't always a reflection on the overall, how if things get slowed down there, it doesn't mean that the project's not going to go through, but it does mean maybe there's other steps and there's a bit more of a discussion we're having internally about a project. Um, and ultimately, because the Oxford delegates have this responsibility of making sure that everything the press publishes is really up to the highest standard, they take that seriously. And so, it's for me to navigate and again to keep hopefully the author informed. Um, but just something to keep in mind when you're in a process like this, always feel free to reach out to the editor, and so they can give you the kind of most up-to-date information about what's going on. Um, if everything goes well with the delegates, they approve, then I'm in the position usually to offer a contract. Um, And sometimes that contract, especially if you're an early career researcher, will have a caveat, which is that um, maybe depending on how finished the manuscript was to begin with, when it started this process, it might have to go out for a final review when the manuscript is um, submitted later on and complete. Usually that's a lighter review. It's just to make sure that what was finally submitted matches what was approved by the delegates and matches what was proposed by the author. Um, but it's again, it always varies, but there are these other possible layers of review. So um, it's something to keep in mind and something to ask the editor about too. So just to say a few words about the proposal as a document, this is the main thing for us at OUP that's going through a process. If it's based on your thesis, we'll also want to see a copy of the thesis generally. If it's not based on a thesis, we'll want to see a couple of sample chapters, and those will also be part of the review process. But ideally, the proposal really spells out what your research is all about. And it's the first thing that usually I look at before I look at a thesis or examiner's reports, which you can also send if it's based on your thesis, if the proposal is based on your thesis. Before I look at any of that, I'm really looking at the proposal because hopefully that's where I can get an overview of the project and just a general sense of where it might or might not fit with a series or where it might or might not fit with our kind of publishing priorities. Um, so uh, one thing maybe worth knowing about that too, and worth knowing about me, which may also be true of other editors. I think it always will depend, but I'm not an international lawyer by background. I have a PhD in political theory, so maybe it's not too far off, but at the same time, I've been in this role for a number of years. I'm familiar with the field, of course, but I say this just as a note to say it's helpful to give a way into your even very academic monograph for someone who, just imagine there's someone who doesn't know the field really well, doesn't know it as well as you. You've just done a doctorate in this field. Um, so you want to kind of give away in the proposal a sort of big picture statement about what your project is about, what issues it's dealing with, and why they're important. You can also think of this in terms of, what would you say to a first or second year law student to explain to them why your research is important? How would you break it down for someone at that level? Someone who's interested, who wants to know, who wants to understand, but isn't as close to the material as you are. And maybe they have some knowledge about the field, but they don't know your specialty like you do. I think that's always the thing to keep in mind with the proposal. You want to lead the person reading it into your topic a bit. Um, I think the other thing just to flag about, or another major thing to flag about the proposal is that the thesis that you've written or that you will have written is not exactly the same as a book, right? I mean, you've read plenty of monographs in your field. Some of them maybe sound a little bit like theses, but some of them you can kind of tell that there's been more that's gone into it. That even if often people's first book, their research is from their thesis, um, the way it's written, the way it's composed can be a bit different. And the main difference is that it's written for an audience that goes beyond your committee or your examiners. Um, it's for people in the field, people who want to know about your topic, who are interested in international law, interested in cultural heritage, law and policy. Um, so they're not the general reader. It's not necessarily, most books on these kind of academic books that we publish and that you will write, especially first books, they're, not for the person who's browsing at Barnes and Noble, um, usually, but at the same time, they're not only for the top three people who know about your topic, who are going to be the ones most likely kind of examining your thesis. So I think it's trying to find that sweet spot in terms of audience. And I think a lot of the main thing I would advise people to think about when revising a thesis into a book is how do I make this legible for a slightly wider audience? And in the proposal, I'm usually looking for some acknowledgement of that, acknowledgement of the fact that there's going to be revisions. It's going to change a bit from how it was written as a thesis. Hopefully the review process helps you do that. but also that maybe you have your own ideas to start with about how the book might be a little different from the thesis, or how even based on your defense or your examiner's reports, that there were things that came up there that you're also thinking about, um, you might do differently in the book than you did in the thesis. That it might have different parts. It might not start with this kind of very granular literature review like many theses do. So thinking about the format, thinking about the audience, it's good to reflect your thinking on that in the proposal. And then the last thing I'll say about the proposal document, and I think there'll be plenty of time for questions for, other things that you might be wondering about this, but just another common thing I note is that um, it's very tempting to say when you're talking about complementary, or even sometimes they're called competing titles, sometimes complementary titles, things that where your book fits in the literature. You're asked in the proposal to provide a bit of information on this. Where does your research sit vis-a-vis other research in the field? Um, Sometimes it's easy to say, well, no one's written about this topic, because in the way that you've done your research, and sometimes no one has looked at uh, the application of this statute to this problem. Um, and so it's true, no one else has done that. But it's also very helpful to know, in fact, how you are building on what other people have done. And I emphasize this because I think sometimes this is what people leave out. Your research is unique. You're doing something no one's ever done. It's a contribution to knowledge that does not exist. But of course, it builds on other things, and it fits hopefully within a constellation of other books on related topics, or topics or perspectives that cover a piece of the kind of larger field, and yours is providing a new perspective and a new way in, and it's addressing a new problem, but it's linked to all these other things. I think you want to show actually how your book is linked to and is part of this kind of scholarly conversation, rather than merely saying, well, no one's written about this before. Because something that's no one's written about, the reason could be because it's not important in the field. But of course, you've written about it, you've chosen your topic because you think it is important, because you think it is linked to the research that other people are doing. So I think showing that is really essential in the proposal itself. Um, the last thing I'll say before I give it back to you, Anna, is not so much about the proposal, but just about acceptance and rejection. Because I think this, I know it can be fraught. It can be anxiety inducing to share your work with someone, to go through part of a process and then have it rejected, or to, you know, um, get bad or sort of critical reviews from peer reviewers. Um, just to say that from my side, there are a lot of contingencies in the books we choose to publish and those we don't choose to. And often I think we're actually overloaded with good quality work, which is, from our perspective, it's a good problem to have, but it's tough. It's tough if you're, especially an early career researcher, working on your first book, and you think, and everyone tells you, and it is very good, but maybe it just doesn't fit with the priorities that a publisher has at a given moment. Or maybe we just published something on too similar a topic, or we just signed something on too similar a topic, and it's hard to justify as an editor two books on the same topic that you acquire in a month. Whatever it is, I think there's just a lot of things that uh, you know we want to find the absolute best work, and we want to find work that has a certain impact and is timed right. So don't be discouraged, even if your book and your project doesn't find a home right away, or doesn't find the home that you imagined was ideal for it. I think usually there is a place for most good quality research. I think it tends to find a place. Books that I know, I've said this isn't right for OUP. I've seen published with other publishers and do very well. Um, so sometimes it's a matter of timing. Sometimes it's not in your control. Um, I think, you know, uh, ideally, ideally your book will find a home, even if it's not with the place you imagined. And then there's always, future opportunities too. And I always tell, especially early career authors, um, if I like the work, but it's just not right for OUP right now, I will always say, please do stay in touch, and come back and talk to me in the future about your other projects, because I see the potential in this. I'm sorry it couldn't work right now, but I like to have a wide network of people who I know are doing interesting work. So I think all editors are the same in that way. So do feel free to stay in touch, I think, and to build relationships as part of this process. I know it's important to me to be building relationships with junior scholars. And I assume it is for series editors and for other editors at other presses. So stick with it is sort of my message here, just in case it doesn't work out right away.
Thank you so much, Robert. Robert invited me to talk about the series as a short introduction. I'll do that, but I'll encourage also participants to start putting their questions in the chat so that we can start that discussion going as well. And I'm happy to talk. And in some ways, Robert, I've got to say each one of those things that you've put, I can give an example, personal example of the things that you've been talking about, and generally do, especially to younger colleagues, because once you've gone through it, you realize that it's not unusual, if that makes sense. Just to go back to the series, it was actually started as an idea because of my original experience in trying, and this is now several decades ago, of publishing my doctoral research, because it was at that time a very new or relatively new area where there was no dedicated series in the field. And that made sense at that time because it was sort of quite disparate, but there was a lot more scholarship coming through. So, and that's why I'm really grateful to OUP that they took that idea on board, is especially younger scholars. I'm very conscious that when you're doing your PhD, it's quite a privilege to have that dedicated time to look at a particular topic. And that's when people quite often produce their best work, because of the ability to have that dedicated time. So it is a series that was born of that. And that's why this webinar, as part of that, is encouraging younger scholars to consider this series. But also, as Robert said, there are other series which may be indeed more suitable. And so I'll speak to what this series is. It's very much a law and policy. The idea was that a lot of the legal discussions in the field, and they continue to be, not very, as I would say, rigorous in some quarters, and that is very difficult for the field. Yeah, it, in some ways, it inhibits its development, but these kinds of avenues of publishing rigorous academic scholarship, legal scholarship, but also, and this is why it's called law and policy, is that we are also acknowledging that a lot of the work done in this field around whether it be regulation or indeed development of how the field is going to progress goes outside of the bounds of law. So it is a broader series, and it is also recognising, and this is what Rob was talking about, speaking to multiple audiences, it is a field that engages across disciplines. So as a lawyer, I'm an international lawyer, and I'll talk about that. I need to be able to talk or write in a way, and indeed talk in a way, that is accessible to others that are not lawyers. If my work is to be effective, if it's to be taken up, it has to be accessible across those audiences, including the general public. I think we're very fortunate in that we work in an area where there are wonderful examples. I had a meeting yesterday with colleagues about something completely different, about capacity building, and you can give stories where anyone can engage, and there is no excuse. I'm telling you now. I mean, you just open up any social media feed, or indeed the legacy media, and you'll have examples where people absolutely know what you're talking about when you're wanting to talk about why is your research important. Yeah, because you can justify that with the stories that can be told in everyday life of people across the world. So as I said, it's a legal series. I'm a public international lawyer, but we know that every part of law can be engaged with looking at cultural heritage from a specific point of view. And that's something that I absolutely would encourage people, whether you're a private lawyer, a private international lawyer, various branches of private law, but also various parts of public international law. And you will see that in the series. Yeah, there people have done specific parts of cultural heritage or specific parts of international law, such as state succession. We are open to all of that, and there's certainly a lot more work that needs to be done, and we're looking for good scholarship in that area. I'm also very conscious. It's a very early hour here. Robert's in New York. I know that there are colleagues in other parts of Oceania. I'm in Australia, but also Asia and also the MENA and Africa and Europe, where we're absolutely looking for authors to hear those voices from those various parts of the world as to the urgency. And we know this is a topic that engages all regions of the world. Indeed, that is reflected in our advisory board. To bring those to the fore, yeah, because we know that how people perceive these these areas is different across the world, and that's really important for us to reflect in the series as well. So I'll open the discussion up, and can't stress enough to you that, as Robert has indicated, both he and I, Robert probably can attest to this, and hopefully the colleagues that have published in the series can attest to this, both myself and Francesco, when he was with us. We are very engaged as series editors in all of those. We're walking you through the process from beginning, preparing the book proposal, even thinking about the series, through to the review process, and I can give you examples of that as well, but also through to the production process, the publication process, which each of those are quite unique. But absolutely, we would encourage you to approach us. This is part of that demystification process today. So I'll open the chat up. I can't see people. There are people here, but Robert, I'll probably start off because people can be quite shy about starting the questions. I'll start from the beginning of it. You mentioned in relation to the book proposal, and quite rightly, Robert has said that we have provided links to all the wonderful resources that OUP have prepared in relation to each one of these steps. It is I can't stress enough, and Robert can speak to this, is to please have a look at what is expected, thank you, Robert, for a book proposal from whichever publisher you're looking at. Each of them might be slightly different. The bones of it are often the same, but obviously you need to make sure that they are aware. It's a matter of courtesy that you've addressed what they want in a book proposal. Yeah, and I'm really grateful to Robert in that he has acknowledged that you are able to approach multiple publishers, because it does take time and people are quite anxious to get their work out there, obviously. But please do have a look at what each publisher expects from a book proposal. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, Robert.
No, I think that's right, and I think it's very helpful. It's a practical matter, right? Like if our practice internally is that we need, as I think most publishers will be, but just for example, we need a statement of where your book sits in the literature, and then you omit that, then the best case scenario is I have to go back to you and ask for it. The worst case scenario is I say, okay, well, I don't have a sense of where this is in the literature. I can't make sense of it, so I don't think this is right for us. When maybe I would have been swayed by having that information. So you don't want to get rejected for that. And I think most of the time you wouldn't if the project is of interest. I will try to pursue it, but I think it's just helpful to do it up front.
Um, and the other thing is that I think people need to realize, even though we're dealing with an academic press, it's still a sales pitch, right? So what, I don't know whether, Robert, you were probably trying to not use the words, but even with your thesis, but you need to hook the reader in. Yeah. So what is it that you can imagine these people have piles of things that they need to read. How is yours going to stand out? What is the hook in relation to the topic? Yeah. And that's why I mentioned the examples of everyday events. Why would this be at the forefront of a readership? You need to establish a readership for the publisher. It may already be an easy sell if, as Robert said, they've already published in this area. And indeed, that's what I did, even though there wasn't series. I knew, look, I'd use these books. Then these publishers clearly understood that there was a readership in this field. Yeah, and they may be interested. Indeed, as it turned out, they were the ones that were interested. So it's an easy fit. But when you're both translating it to the publisher, but also translating it so that they can see that you can write for that more generalist audience, not just a specialist. Obviously, you need to convince those that are in your field that what you're saying is important, but it's also engaging the wider audience. Yeah, especially in our field, it just is enlivened by across many audiences, whether it's law, whether it's other disciplines, or the general public. It's really important. I've got a question for Ayala, and I know it's really early there in Adelaide. Ayala, this is a really important question for people, especially our participants today, is for those that are wishing to publish their dissertation that has been successfully defended. How much weight are the examiner's reports for compared to the reviewers for the book proposal?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I do, like I said, I do usually ask to see the examiner's reports. I think the main thing is, um, obviously we want them to be overall positive, right? I mean, it's a good indication if your exam has gone well, that you're on the right track with your research, that it gives me a sense that there are people in the field out there who thought this was a worthy contribution as a thesis. But it's a little bit different, of course, than whether and how it should be framed as a book. And so usually when I'm looking at examiner's reports, I'm really looking to see that in the proposal, to the extent that the examiners might have had some critical comments or some questions, that those are addressed in some way, that the proposal says, even if not explicitly linked to all of the points in the examiner's report, but that the proposal reflects a knowledge on the part of the author that there should be changes before this is published as a book. Um, Beyond that, I mean, examiners' reports um, that are positive are more likely to grab our attention. But if the topic is good and there's other reasons we think the research is of interest and is going to be high quality, then I think it's really just this point about making sure you're kind of addressing the issues or questions raised in the exam, um, showing some awareness that this was actually useful feedback from the examiners in those cases.
The other, and I can give many stories that I do. I often say that I'd like to frame some of the reviews that I've had in the past, because they're just so wonderfully written. They were devastating when you get them, but they're also engaging. Also, and I've had this discussion more recently, is it's really important. I know it's really hard, especially when you're starting off with this and trying to put context in that. And please, it's the other thing is to have a team of people that, or a mentor that you can talk this through with, so you can rationalize it and put it in perspective, which I was very fortunate and have been very fortunate to have. But as Robert said previously, those reviews hopefully will go out to people, and also the examiners will go out to people that have a good knowledge of your field. And the thing that you absolutely don't want is to have something published that you then regret. Oh, look, that is incorrect, or that's not a view. It's not the way that I intended it to come out or come across. Yeah. So hopefully, as Robert said, each one of those things, both the examiner's reports, but also the reviewers' reports, should be taken as taking them on board and how I can refine what will go out in the world. Yeah, because that will be around for a while afterwards. Yeah, and I can attest to that. Yeah, it's really, really important. So thank you, Ayala, for that question. It's a really important one. And also I'd like to stress what Robert said earlier, that, and I've said this more so these days, that the theses, it's a very particular way of writing, and it doesn't necessarily directly translate into a monograph. So that there will, even though the press does request the dissertation that you've submitted, there shouldn't necessarily be the expectation that will directly translate as the publication, that there will be work to be done. The other thing I would really like to do, I always put up a follow-up question, is stress that it's really important that you persist with it, and also, and this is the advice I give because it's so fresh in your mind, is try and get those proposals out as soon as possible after you've gotten or completed the thesis, or get that process going along, because it's already fresh in your mind. Yeah, the longer you leave it, as I've seen this in from other people's experience, the longer you leave it, the harder it will be. That process will be a longer process. Whereas when it's fresh in your mind, knowing what everything that Robert has said and what I have said, that it's still, if you start that idea of, okay, I want this out in the world, think about it quite early on. Yeah. Okay. Just a very quick follow-up question for Ayala is, I think you may have actually answered this, Robert, is if there's two or three reviewers and one of them or a couple of them might be contradictory.
Yeah, I think it always depends a bit because there really is so much range sometimes in the reviews. I mean, you get reviews that are, like I sort of alluded to before, really supportive but have a ton of criticisms, which is always sort of a funny thing. And I think potentially helpful to the author to have a bunch of critical comments to reflect on. I mean, hopefully they're constructive. That's what we expect from the reviewers. Um, but I think if there's two or three reviews and if one is really supportive, one's more critical, I'll usually give the author a chance to revise and resubmit it with the idea that I'll check with the critical reviewer again and say, okay, is this more along the lines of what you think would be high quality publication? But also at that point, I would bring in another reviewer because I think it's fairer to the author to have a third perspective if there were two, let's say, a third perspective where someone's looking at it for the first time and not thinking of it in terms of what they saw during the first round. Um, if it's if it's two, if there's three reviewers and two are positive, one is more critical, I would likewise always ask the author to respond. I think if the two are very positive, then it can probably go ahead, but I think it's still useful. I mean, I didn't really say this, but one of the things the delegates are looking for later on, no matter how the review process went, I mean, assuming it went well enough to keep going, they're always looking for some development of the project. They want to see, even where reviewers said like, "Oh, this is great work," that it didn't just then move through, and that the review process actually contributed something to the 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 formation of what will be the book. The delegates themselves are often looking for that, in addition to the substantive points of the project. They want to see that the process played out in this way. So, for me as an editor, that's usually what I'm trying to get at if there are contradictory reviews. How do I move this forward so that the project is enriched and so that there's enough support to bring it to the delegates in the first place?
Okay, I'll move to the next question. It's Arishta Ray. Yeah, there's two questions to this. The first one's a good one, and I'll hand it over to you, but then I'll come back as well, Robert, is if it's an academic monograph, how do we show that it's marketable? And I'm happy to throw that to you. And the second question is about the size preference.
Mm.
How big or small does the monograph have to be? And I'm happy to talk to that as well, but go for it, Robert. So, given it's academic, how do you show that it's marketable?
Yeah, I think the main thing is we I deal in academic books, so that's the starting point. I don't expect most things that I work on to have a general audience really beyond, maybe sometimes they do, sometimes with policymakers, sometimes with students, but the core audience is usually going to be other academics. I think it's a matter of being able to show that that core audience is itself wide enough to justify the book. Um, so it's not just these five people that I see at every conference that I know we're in a conversation together. Of course, they're going to read your book, hopefully. I mean, if, as an absolute minimum, that's who you're writing for. But it's about showing that you are writing for a wider circle. I mean, you could think about it like concentric circles. You're going to have a core audience based on the topic alone and who you are in the field, but you want to kind of be able to show that it can be a little broader than that. If it's interdisciplinary, that's something that makes it a little broader. Not every project is going to be interdisciplinary. I recognize that. But just for example, or if you say, I work on people in this area of cultural heritage law, but this is also interesting for people who work on treaty interpretation, right? That's a way of showing that there's a wider audience for it. So it's about articulating that. To the second question, in terms of size and length, I mean, it really, every topic is different. I think the main thing is I would hope that most books are not longer than they need to be, but they are as long as they need to be, which is not that helpful an answer, I recognize. But, it's like you shouldn't cut out something essential just for the sake of length. If you say this is really central to these are all the points that need to be covered for me to really give an in-depth and sufficient treatment of this topic, then leave them in. But if you're not sure, I think it's worth asking colleagues, mentors, what they think about it, asking an editor what they think about it. Um, and I think, uh, you, the longer a book gets, the higher we have to price it. And the more higher we have to price it, the fewer people are going to read it. I mean, that's just the kind of reality of the business of academic publishing. Um, so you don't want it to be longer than it needs to be. At the same time, if it needs to be of a certain length, then I think just being clear in your rationale for that is the main point.
And it's a bit like on the last point, and hopefully you're getting some of this advice in relation to your PhD. If you're doing a PhD, it's being kind to your reader. How long, will their attention span be kept, and to convince them of what you're trying to say? So it's really, really important. My sister, who is visiting here from the United States, told me when I was doing my PhD, she gave me the advice of the guy with the beautiful mind that his PhD, which he won a Nobel Prize for, was 20 pages long. So, I mean, it's not a question of that, what is the length that's required? And it can be longer, yeah, obviously, than 20 pages. But it is a matter of what will make it the most effective, as Robert said. So, and again, when it tends to meander, it's probably less effective, especially these days. In relation to, and it's a point that Robert reiterated here, and I will say it again because he said it, and I was thinking about that when he said it originally, is we quite often, when we're putting a book proposal together, trying to say that it's original, right? But that's then narrowing the potential audience, yeah. And nobody else is published in this area. Well, you have to ask yourself, why is there an audience? Whereas if you can connect the dots for a publisher, for others, of, okay, this may not necessarily be directly something that I'm interested in, as Robert said, but if it's something like the law of treaties, or as I mentioned earlier, state succession, where it's a really important a larger readership, it becomes really interesting for those people as well. Let's be fair, it's already a given audience that you will have because it's part of a series if it's published in the series, so people will be already looking at new titles, so you already have that. But as Robert said, as a publisher, they need to justify its inclusion in the series of how does it fit within this, yeah, for a readership and building the readership of the series. So it's really important. And also then your work leverages that. It's open to those audiences. And I'm noticing the time, so I'll put the last question to Robert, is whether a case study focused thesis can translate into a monograph. And I'm happy to speak to this as the series editor, but I'll let you answer that, Robert, more generally first.
Yeah, it's a good question because I think there are some sort of, I guess it really depends how narrow you're thinking about a case study. I mean, I think there are case studies that are so essential for the development of law in a certain area where the implications are there to write a full monograph about it to make sure that, it's for people who aren't just focused on that case, that the implications are clear, that it has this relevance. It's sort of to the question I was answering before about making a book marketable. I mean, marketable in an academic book really just means of interest to a wide academic audience. So I think that's the key, even if you're focused on a single case study. Um, I do get proposals where the case study is a bit too narrow or where the wider implications aren't really drawn out. So I think that's the main thing you want to be thinking about if your thesis is based on a case study. I think the other thing, which involves a bit more work, and I know there's career pressures that also make this hard, but you might say, I've done a case study for my thesis. I think it's important, but actually for a book, I would love to have three case studies. And so maybe it takes time to do some more research and, even a matter of years. Again, there's pressure for job applications, for tenure files, for all these other things. So whether that's feasible or not is sort of something you have to decide in your particular situation. But I think sometimes widening out and choosing a few case studies actually makes for a richer monograph. But there are definitely exceptions.
I'll answer that question from the series point of view. And when you said case study, I thought I meant it's usually a case study around a particular country or a particular jurisdiction from a legal point of view. And because the series is an international series, it would need, as Robert said, you would need to justify why this would be of interest to people in other parts of the world. Otherwise, why not choose a series or a publisher that focuses particularly on that jurisdiction, if that makes sense? Unless the case study, as Robert said, has wider implications, and then you would need to develop that out. Yeah, I generally, and I don't think we have, because I would push back against a case study that looked at a particular jurisdiction only. It would be very, very difficult. I mean, even we encourage comparativist work, but even obviously that doesn't work on that level. So it would be something where, as Robert indicated, we would encourage the person proposing that monograph to consider the inclusion of other case studies to broaden the reach. Yeah, because that's the intent of the series as well, is that how that knowledge can be translated into other jurisdictions to develop the law, yeah, for others that are looking at this area. So it's something that's really, really important. It's a really good question, actually, because yeah, obviously people are looking at a particular jurisdiction often when they're doing their PhD. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I thought we were going to have much more by way of discussion, and hopefully, and obviously, it goes without saying that both Robert and I are available should you have further follow-up questions, and you're absolutely encouraged, and I'll put that in the follow-up emails to people. So thank you again to Robert from OUP, New York. It's home time for him for this hands-on discussion on the book proposal submission process with Oxford University Press and the Cultural Heritage Law and Policy series in particular. We hope that this discussion has demystified somewhat this important next step in your careers as researchers and academics in the publication of your doctoral research. Thank you to all participants for joining us in our discussion today, particularly those that have raised questions at the late hour in Europe and Africa and to the very early hour in the Asia Pacific. We look forward to having you join us for our next webinar series in the ECR development series. Participants are reminded that the link to this video will be provided to attendees in coming days. Thank you to all for joining us, especially Robert. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.